For this session, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Rob Adams. Rob leads city design at the City of Melbourne in Australia. Since joining the City of Melbourne in 1985, Rob has led the rejuvenation of central Melbourne. He received the Prime Minister's Environmentalist of the Year in 2008, the Order of Australia in 2007, and the Australian Institute of Architects National President's Award in 2018. And his City of Melbourne City Design team have received over 150 international, state, and local awards. Rob will lead this briefing session and manage the Q&A session. Over to you, Rob.
It's my great pleasure to be your host and MC tonight. But before I get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm speaking to you from, and they are the Boonwurrung, Boonwurrung, and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'm excited that we are talking about cities and particularly urban forests. And I say that because I think when we talk about the subject of climate change, too often we don't contextualize it. We leave it as a broad topic, and it is such a mind-numbing topic for many people that the tendency is to switch off and not engage with it. But if you set the context of climate change within cities, suddenly the question becomes able to be grappled with. You can, with cities, look at a whole lot of strategies. Tonight, we've got two very eminent speakers who are going to talk about urban forests and the heat island effect in our cities. I've been interested in cities for a long time. In fact, I traveled as a student in 1969 over to Europe. And shortly after that, Alvin Toffler brought out his book, Future Shock. And what it predicted was a huge population growth for the world. And I remember sitting and wondering about how we deal with that. At the same time, I learned that as people move to cities, their family sizes become smaller as the family gets more choice. And so clearly, the movement to cities and the migration to cities is part of the solution to reducing population and therefore making the planet a place that we can all sustain and live on. We currently have 4.4 billion people living in cities, and that's going to rise to 6.4 by 2050. So if we don't get cities right and don't realize that cities are a really important part of the solution, then the future does not look very interesting. I was listening to the news a few hours ago, and in Karachi today, it's 50 degrees. And they predict that 1,200 people will die going through this heat wave. We've seen this happen in Australia. It goes back to a Saturday in September 2009 at 4:22 p.m. when we had 46.4 degrees. So not 50, but 46.4. It was our hottest day ever, and 173 people died in bushfires over the next few days. The figure that only came out much later is 374 died from heat exhaustion. This scenario is being played out across our planet today, in California, in Europe, in Greece, and we see it on the news. And it's something that in many ways is frightening. And it should be, because we need to in fact rise and act and look at how we're going to deal with the heat island effect and making our cities livable. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce the two speakers that are going to lead this. The first speaker is Cecil Konijnendijk, and Cecil has over 25 years experience studying, teaching and advising on aspects of urban forestry and nature-based solutions. He's widely considered as one of the world's leading urban forestry experts, and his work has been featured in leading media outlets such as CNBC and in international documentary films. Since 2016, he has been a professor of urban forestry at the University of British Columbia, And Cecil helped find the leading academic journal, Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, and edited seminal textbooks such as the Rutledge Handbook on Urban Forestry. Cecil's title for his talk is From Nature's Benefit to Policy Implementation, the Urban Forestry Experience. Cecil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that kind introduction. And it's great to be with you. And it's also very special for me to be in the company of Ian Shears, who's a really good colleague, as well as Rob Adams. And I had the pleasure to visit Melbourne at several occasions and see some of the exciting work that's been going on there. So I think Rob has already sketched the challenge that we're all facing, of course, these days. So I'll try to break down exactly that kind of overwhelming challenge of climate change, to bring it into the urban context, and then more specifically to see what urban forestry, urban trees and urban green spaces can do to actually grapple with this challenge in ways that are understandable also for individual residents, for example. So I had the pleasure until summer last year to live in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is one of those very iconic green cities in the world. And depending on from what angle you take the picture of the city, you'll see an urban forest that is creating a lot of life quality in cities like that. And in Vancouver this summer, when we hit record temperatures, the urban forest really came in a very special role, cooling the city. And it's estimated that several hundreds of people died, were excess deaths because of this heat wave. And of course, urban forests and urban trees can really play a role there. Even if it's cooling maybe a few centigrades, it can actually have quite an impact. So moving from Vancouver, as I did recently, I realized also that this kind of connection to green spaces is of course crucial, and not only in times of climate change, but also in times of global pandemics as we've been facing today. And I think many of us who might have had some reservations about the importance of nearby urban forest and green spaces have probably started reappreciating the nearness of green spaces. And while here in Vancouver, it was still allowed to use green spaces during the first phase of the pandemic, in other places, of course, parks and green spaces were closed off because of the fear of people gathering and the virus spreading. So, of course, this also then links to how we connect in general to the places where we live. And I always make a point of trying to connect to places by walking through cities and really engaging with the urban forest and with the landscape, as I did also when I left Vancouver last summer and moved to another beautiful city, the city of Barcelona here in Spain. And of course, a city like Barcelona, again, faces tremendous issues in terms of climate change and heat waves. Even now, when we're well into September, the humidity and the heat is still very tangible. And of course, also cities like Barcelona have to face with the fact that these are old and very dense cities where maybe it's very difficult to start retrofitting with green spaces and urban forests to get some of those benefits. But even in cities that maybe have less obvious trees into their core, there's a very strong connection between people and trees. And you just have to look at the work of the famous architect Antoni Gaudí to see how he was inspired by the fact that trees and forests create spaces where people want to live. And of course, the Sagrada Familia is a really great example of that. So we've always brought trees with us into our cities for different reasons, not only, of course, for making cool and comfortable places. And then in other cases, like here in Hong Kong, of course, it's very difficult to find a little bit of green and to find maybe those little cool islands where the urban forest provides us with a bit of respite from the heat. And then we flock to shopping malls and other places where we spend a lot of energy and a lot of money on air conditioning. Currently in Spain, energy prices are 4 times as high as they were last summer. So it means actually that for many people, having air conditioning on is no longer an option simply because they cannot afford it economically. So just air conditioning our spaces is not going to be the solution to climate change adaptation, obviously. We have to be much more clever and much more nature-based in how we adapt our cities. So climate change is a key issue, obviously, on the bigger picture of cities and human society. And this comes with other grand challenges like water scarcity, biodiversity loss, general challenges to public health, as well as poverty. And then, of course, some of these aspects have also resulted in more immediate challenges, such as COVID-19, and such as some of these extreme weather events and resulting issues, as Rob also mentioned, with the bushfires in Australia, as well as, of course, conflicts that can emerge quite rapidly over cities and over land and over water, for example. So rather than maybe having a doom thinking perspective, of course, we try to in urban forestry and urban greening, we try to look at this as an opportunity as well. And there are some trends and some positive developments, I think, that are hopeful. There's a reappreciation of nearby nature, for example, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's, of course, much more in-depth understanding of the importance of green infrastructure and green spaces in the climate change agenda. There's also a mainstreaming occurring of urban nature. It's more common, I think, now for politicians and decision makers, also outside of the green sector, as I would call it, to pay attention to the nature-based solutions that can be provided. And maybe even approach of nature-based thinking that I will briefly introduce a little bit later. But of course, it also means that there's actually a need for good governance approaches in developing green cities and for leadership that inspires, that actually brings people from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different disciplinary perspectives together, but also across government, businesses, and civic society. And this then, of course, also requires people who can base themselves on a good education and a good training, specifically within this field of greening cities. So my own field of practice for the past 25 or so years, almost 30 years now, is urban forestry. And it is this kind of oxymoron of how we bring a natural resource management perspective, a long-term perspective, working with trees and forests into our cities in order to provide all these different benefits that green spaces can have for us. And it has now really become a pretty well-established field, officially grounded in the mid-1960s. There's now quite a bit of evidence also to support the work that we're doing in urban forestry. And of course, one of the key results of all this work is that we have evidence in many areas of tree benefits these days. So we know, of course, that trees are good. We know also very specifically why trees are good for people in cities, but of course also outside cities. And this has been captured in good research papers. There's a lot of literature, a lot of good science these days, but also in infographics, like, for example, these ones by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and the one that we did a few years ago for a conference in Vancouver. Some clear sound bites that actually really make it clear how powerful the impact of trees and urban forests can be on our cities and on our urban communities. And there's some aspects emerging, I would say, as new research topics, and we start understanding that urban forest relation to people and people's links to trees and nature are pretty complex. And one of the emerging fields is, for example, that the visible aspect of green, seeing trees from your window, for example, has a tremendous impact on people's health and well-being. So while we have been tending maybe to focus on things like canopy cover and physical access to nearby parks, we start realizing now that people actually need to have continuous visual access to nature and to green. Seeing a tree out of your window, out of your school, out of your workplace can have a really big impact, not only on your health and well-being, but also on things like creativity and your performance at the workplace or in your school. And of course, we know about the cooling effects to shading, to evapotranspiration. This picture from Dubai is quite obvious that workers in many countries actually are faced with these very tough conditions, having to do physical work outside. And the case of Qatar, of course, is a very dramatic case in point where many workers, often immigrant workers, have to build soccer stadiums, football stadiums, and thousands of these workers are dying because of accidents, but also because, of course, the tremendous heat in these countries. And then when there is a little bit of shade, that can provide a little bit of respite for these workers. So I already mentioned that we're getting better insight in why urban forests are helping us in terms of climate action. And some of the really interesting work has been done by Professor Carly Zieter in Concordia University in Montreal, who has been doing some really very precise work on what kind of canopy cover are we looking for in terms of providing local cooling effects. And Dr. Zieter's work states basically that when we're hitting a 40% canopy cover, we see really a non-linear increase in cooling effects, local cooling effects. But 40% canopy, of course, for many cities is quite something to achieve. It's not always the easiest. We also know from research from Australia by Thomas Astelbert and others that when we hit about a 30% canopy cover at the neighborhood level, we see dramatic increases in people's health and well-being. But the fact that trees are good and that many of us realize that trees are good doesn't mean that people always appreciate trees. There could be reasons why nature in cities can be scary to people. Trees, of course, can be a risk in some cases. There's issues with pests and diseases. There's issues with wild animals. And there's also the issue that sometimes people just don't feel they want to go out to nature because they think it's uncomfortable. So we sometimes have to overcome these kind of fears and these kind of ideas about nature maybe not being so good for us. And there's of course also issues here in terms of cultural differences and people's appreciation of nature, as well as what people are used to experience. So I think we can argue, as I already mentioned earlier in my talk, that we are actually facing a new era for urban forestry, in the sense that there's a tremendous boost in the number of plans and strategies that are highlighting the contributions of trees and other nature in cities. And this is at the global level. Think about the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. Also the United Nations Decade on Restoration, where urban ecosystems are featured. But also at the European level here, the national level, and of course as well at the local level in places like London and Melbourne. So there's a lot of policy attention, a lot of strategic attention these days for integrating green and nature into our strategies in urban development. And work from projects like the Nativation project here, of course, also talk about this nature-based solutions concept. So how can nature help us to solve or at least manage some of these problems that we face as human societies today? And of course, we start understanding more and more that these relationships can be pretty complex. It's not just a quick fix to use nature, but on the other hand, nature can often generate multiple solutions at the same time, of course. And think about the trees, a tree providing cooling as well as mental health benefits, as well as providing a habitat for wildlife. And at the local level, we see some really interesting innovations like London's National Park City concept, the national urban parks that we see emerging, starting in Sweden and Finland, and now also in countries like Canada, where there's now a national rollout of urban national parks, which is a very exciting development. But of course, then people will say, well, this is all great and wonderful, but it's not so easy to start bringing forests or trees into our cities. We often have already used all the space. But there are some really interesting innovations, some of them very technical, some of them almost more conceptual. So sometimes you can infill, use some of the space that comes open, for example, when industries leave or when housing changes. We can sometimes reclaim land from the sea or, for example, from garbage dumping areas. We can also take the forest up and create elevated and even vertical forests, as for example, the iconic Bosco Verticale in Milan. We can transplant forests, as I will show you one example from Tokyo. We can also sometimes let nature do more of the work and follow a more rewilding approach. And then, of course, it's also about creating mental, imaginary relations sometimes between people and trees, and make sure that even a single tree on a school playground can be perceived as a world of its own and a connection to wild and nature. So this is a really exciting project. I think one of the many projects that's providing inspiration to people, the Otamachi Tower project in Tokyo, where a forest was created outside of the city, then cut off in pieces after a few years when it had established, had a soil layer, and then re-established here in the CBD, in the central business district of Tokyo, to create almost an instant forest experience for the workers in this area. Of course, not coming at a very low cost, but on the other hand, a very innovative way of creating a unique experience in this very urban environment. And countries like China are rapidly following some of these developments. So some of the more traditional conventional parks in China, in cities like Beijing, are being transformed into forest-like parks. And the idea of forest cities is now a national policy in China as well. And this is the Guangyanggu Valley in Beijing, about 1 kilometer from Tiananmen Square, where, I said, a more classic park with horticultural areas and grass has been developed in this much more forest-like environment with different layers and about 50 different tree species. And then, of course, also we know that some really exciting work is going on in the Middle East. Yvonne Lynch, who used to work with Ian and others in Melbourne, has done some really interesting work with her team in Riyadh, in the Green Riyadh project, where a city that has a canopy cover right now of less than 1% is striving for at least a 10, maybe 15% canopy cover, by being clever about what to do in terms of greening, using wastewater, recycled water in much more efficient ways, and also kind of establishing or re-establishing a culture of people going to parks and nature and seeing it as part of their daily environment. Here in Barcelona, just around the corner where I'm sitting right now, some of the major traffic corridors have been transformed into linear parks. So there's still some traffic, but it's combined with biking. And then you get this really interesting environments where people can can meet each other, can play, and where there's also room, for example, for stormwater regulation and cooling effects. And Barcelona, of course, has been really active also by creating the so-called super block structure, where blocks of 3 by 3 are created into a super block, where within those blocks, there's much more focus on public spaces, on tree planting, and the traffic is slowly being moved out to the perimeter of these blocks. So while we do this, and I'm getting to the final stages of my presentation here, we have to think really cleverly. And there's some really exciting research from the field of, for example, forest ecology that starts feeding into also urban settings. The work of Professor Suzanne Samard, my colleague at UBC, her book, Finding the Mother Tree, of course, has become a New York Times bestseller, about how trees actually communicate with each other and exchange information and nutrients, also among species, or not just within the same species. Starts informing the way how we look at, for example, street tree plantings in quite different ways. So there's some really exciting, I think, opportunities to bring in some of this, what I sometimes call nature-based thinking, where we give more room to nature, rather than maybe just trying to control and over-design our natural spaces. There's some really interesting work that links into that, has to do with things like smart urban forestry and the Internet of Nature, which is a term coined by Nadine Galle, who you see here on the right. Really shows that there's a lot of young professionals with a lot of creative ideas coming into this field these days, trying to innovate urban forestry as well. So my own small contribution has been to think about ways of informing policymakers and providing some guidance to policymakers about how do we bring urban forestry forward for climate action, but also for other benefits. And I've always been very hesitant to give very hard guidelines or rules, because of course things are very complex and it depends very much in the context where you are. But I did see in the evidence, there's a tendency to say, well, this 30%, maybe 40% canopy cover is actually where you start seeing these climate adaptation and health benefits kick in. We also know from the work from the World Health Organization and others that when you have a 300-meter distance maximum to your nearest green space, you're much more inclined to use that green space, and with that also generate health benefits. So that's the 30-300 in this rule that I came up with a few months ago, the 330-300 rule. And then the 3 in that is actually has to do with this idea of visible green. So trying to make sure that people actually have visual access from the places where they live, be it an apartment or a house, and being able to see nature. So 30-300, pretty strong evidence, as I mentioned. 3 is actually starting to emerge as something that could be really important as well. So it's kind of a gimmick, I realize that, but it actually does give people an idea of how to move forward when we want to bring green into not just the city level. Of course, it's great to have 30% canopy in a city, but really try to start thinking about how can we make sure green percolates all the way into people's doorsteps, into neighborhoods, because that's where, of course, the benefits are delivered. And this is across socio-demographic groups as well, because we don't want just the rich parts of the city to be greened. So this is how it looks from my apartment: more than 3 trees, more than 30% canopy in my street at least, and less than 300 meters to the nearest green space. And this has actually been picked up quite a bit. So a number of cities across the world have now started implementing 330-300 as a guiding principle to say, well, we want to have at least some kind of idea overall where we want to go for climate adaptation and health promotion. And also organizations like Greenpeace Spain have started recommending it as part of their greening, city greening campaigns. And I think that's exciting because if not anything else, it shows, or it provides a platform for discussion and debate, for talking about all these different benefits that urban forests provide, and for also bringing in experts who actually can deliver on simple rules like this. So I think we do see a time, and of course we are looking at tremendous challenges as humankind. Urbanization is not going to stop. We see countries like India taking in a few hundred more million people into urban areas over the next few decades. But I do think that this actually does create opportunities for urban forestry, in the sense that cities will have to be green in most cases to be successful. There's a few exceptions maybe here and there, but in general, cities will have to embrace green. There will have to be green cities, forest cities, maybe biophilic cities in order to be successful in the future. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to Rob.
Thanks very much, Cecil. That was an excellent, and I love the 330-300. I think that's such a good way of communicating that. So our next speaker, and before I go there, there is a Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. You'd help me as your MC if you asked some questions. So please feel free to go down there and put some questions in. Ian Shears is the principal of Ian Shears Green Infrastructure and Urban Forestry. And Ian is acknowledged as one of Australia's experts in the urban landscapes and as an experienced practitioner in public open space design, implementation, and management. He has specialized in urban greening for 30 years and worked for 19 years with the City of Melbourne. And it was a great pleasure to work with Ian at the City of Melbourne, where he achieved an enormous amount, which I'm hoping he'll tell you about shortly. He currently advises a range of governments nationally and internationally on policy and practice of urban greening. Ian and his team have been credited with developing some of Australia's most progressive environmental policies, programs, and projects, and won many state, national, and international awards for their work. So Ian, I invite you to join us.
Good. Thank you, Rob. And like you, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we sort of live, work and visit. And acknowledge that I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. What I'd really like to talk about is really sort of picking up on what Rob has started talking about and Cecil was talking about, was around how do we actually get the knowledge that is so apparent around why greening is good for cities in all ways, shapes and forms, and get that into really fantastic outcomes on the ground, so that we can really get all of the benefits that we know can come from nature. And we're facing enormous challenges. Rob has talked about the heat in Karachi. In Australia, we've got an escalating level of extreme weather events and extreme heat days sort of coming up consistently, and our cities, which are not designed to cope with heat, are really becoming quite problematic. So how we start to recognise these challenges, see greening and renaturing the city as a fantastic opportunity and a way that we can move forward in such a positive outcome to transform our cities is really incredibly important. And as Rob mentioned, I spent a few years working at the City of Melbourne, and I'll share with you some of the approaches, some of the programs and some of the work that we delivered over that period of time. And I think probably what was absolutely key to delivering fantastic outcomes was to recognise the complexity of why green is good for us. And I've put it down to sort of listing it in three separate stages. And really it's recognising that the environmental service provision that green infrastructure has is fantastic, both in terms of the co-benefits and the cost effectiveness. So how to go about expanding that within our cities, within our urban context, is incredibly important. Protecting and enhancing ecosystems and biodiversity is something that I don't think we can underestimate, and certainly the importance of ecologies in our cities is something that you really need to focus on and to bring forth for all of the myriad benefits there. And the third way is really to recognise all of the massive health benefits that come through from connecting to nature. And so really looking at ways we can build those biophilic connections and find ways to immerse people in nature. So those are the key drivers. I'll share some of the ways that we looked at that. So really just picking up, there was some major approaches that we adopted, and one was to recognise that to get the holistic outcomes that are so important to renaturing the city, we had to adopt very much a multidisciplinary approach. And so having a huge range of people coming in and working together made an enormous difference in terms of the breadth. So whether the teams had We had arborists, urban foresters, geographers, community engagement specialists and socialists, social experts. So it was really quite an exciting time. But I think one of the keys to getting the city regreened is to have that multidisciplinary approach, to be very aspirational and set visionary targets, and that's based on the data that was collected through really high level technical analysis, and being able to recognise where you can make a difference, what you need to do, how to intervene, and to do it. So this next slide really talks about the suite of strategies that we developed over a period of time running from 2012 up to 2017. But really, as you can see, that each of those targets within the strategies have outputs which lead towards that sort of resilience and livability of Melbourne. And certainly things like doubling the tree canopy cover to decrease and cool temperatures by 4 degrees C was incredibly important. But running from left to right, we're looking at water, space, the forest, biodiversity, adaptation, and greening the built form, all coming together to provide those benefits. So our program was quite broad reaching. Some of the ways that we analysed the space that we were looking at was important, because from a jurisdictional perspective, often cities and City of Melbourne has jurisdiction over only 30% of the footprint. So in ensuring that we can have, if you like, a non-jurisdictional response to the challenges, and if we look at a heat wave, it doesn't stop at artificial boundaries. So we spent some time looking at land use and green contribution. And one of the points that I wanted to make here, looking at these two wheels, is that we noticed that land within the study area, percentage-wise, then compare it to the total contribution of trees. And we see in the blue, for example, the residential area covers a 25% of the area and a 24% contribution of trees. And that's the area where, because of the densification in the city, we're losing a lot of forest. So it's an area of high concern and requiring intervention. The other way to think about it too is to look at both that commercial and industrial, which together again is about 25% of the footprint, yet in terms of tree contribution is only 6%. So we recognise that partnerships, holistic, non-jurisdictional ways of thinking, the contribution of the private realm is something that's absolutely critical towards accelerating, and in Melbourne's case is looking to that 40% canopy cover target set in 2012. An interesting piece of work that we looked at, and obviously recognising within a central city there's not a lot of spare space, we were looking at the various levels and ways that greening could occur, and green roofs was certainly one of the studies that we did. And in this diagram you're looking at a catchment which we refer to the Elizabeth Street catchment, and that's sort of within our jurisdictional boundaries. And we did a study of all of the buildings within our municipality and their capacity to support green roofs. Now, one of the exciting parts of that work, and there in the table on the right, you can see that this area floods down towards the bottom of Elizabeth Street and into the Yarra. The capacity measure of the green roofs was set against what we needed to reduce in water volumes to limit that load, and the flooding reduction figure was put at 6.8 megalitres. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the table up above, you can see that if 25% of the buildings which could support a green roof put a green roof on, and just a shallow substrate roof, it would hold back close to 30 megalitres of water. So that really was a fantastic exercise in aiding our ability to understand what the capacity of a space, an area, is to contribute towards the importance of green infrastructure. And obviously we're talking about maximising the benefits of green and getting as much possible, then we're going to need water to do that. And stormwater, which has traditionally just been captured and put out into rivers and bays is something that we need to hold back in the land. So this type of work is critically important and really refers to the permeability of the city. And most cities are built with hard surface covering that seals off the land, which prevents the soil acting as a soil reservoir and also accelerates sort of pollution of water and runoff. A really good piece of work which was done in Melbourne and done in a number of cities around the world is looking at a resilience plan, and Resilient Melbourne was put together in a way so that multiple jurisdictions and multiple local government agencies could come together with shared targets and shared goals. And the Resilient Melbourne plan had as one of its flagship actions to develop an urban forest strategy for the whole metropolitan area. And I wanted to include this slide because it talks about the benefits of greening in a way which often doesn't get as much coverage as it thinks. So here we're looking at that resilient response to stresses and shocks. And what's really important is that it's recognising that things such as flood, heatwave, drought and marine pollution can all benefit from having a healthy, resilient, thriving urban forest there, but also the stresses. So decreasing social equity, lower rates of community participation, pressure on healthcare services, ageing populations. We're starting to really recognise and to link the outcomes from benefits to the community to the benefits of nature and the thriving sense that nature has, and how we can have a strong natural environment and ecosystems alongside that growing population. One of the successful projects that the City of Melbourne is currently delivering on is called the Urban Forest Fund. And this was developed in a way so that the city could leverage its contribution towards greening outcomes in the private sector. And what has been really sort of quite wonderful in this piece of work is that sort of a small investment from the city, matching dollars which come from the private owner, makes a huge difference to the greening that starts to occur within the private realm. And the city's done a lot of work looking at both advocacy, incentivisation, regulation, but partnering and that shared governance of the space is something which is incredibly important. So this project has started to deliver, some highly important, influential outcomes, and this is one of the outcomes, which is an urban farm, which is currently being constructed on a car park in South Bank, and you can see just by the surroundings there that there's not a significant amount of greening. It's a lot of grey, but listed on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see some of the sort of benefits that come through from this partnering, which wouldn't have occurred without the city actively looking to financially secure connections with the owners, etc. And this has been one of the really sort of, I think, important ways that jurisdictional overview, the governance of the city, we can start to see rules changing where people are coming together and partnering for collective outcomes. One of the incredibly important aspects of urban forestry and the greening interventions that we're looking at currently is, in a way, the fact that we're investing in the future. And the legacy that we hope to leave now is something that is going to, really sort of pay dividends for future generations. And as the old proverb says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is to plant one now. And a lot of the trees that we're planting, we hope to be around for 100 years. So what's the future going to look like? What's the environment going to be like in 100 years' time? And one of the critical aspects which impact on the ability of trees to thrive is temperature. And a lot of trees have a very narrow sort of window in which they operate. And so one of the pieces of research that we did, which is City of Melbourne's Future Urban Forest, was to really look at both existing trees within the forest and what trees we could be planting and how they're going to cope with future temperatures. And so this starts to really bring the importance of science and projecting forward into the way that the city really sort of forms and transforms, and what the successional nature of the tree planting is going to be. And so here is, this work looked at potential trees from all around the planet, and also, so we're starting to see an incredible amount of diversity starting to come through, and it changes things because Melbourne is a city which has, I think, 6,500, 7,000 elm trees, which are a lot of well over 100 years old, and from a heritage perspective, they're incredibly important. But we know from our science that they're not necessarily going to cope well with temperature rises into the future. So it starts to guide decision making now to form what is a legacy that we're going to have in the future. The other part of work that the City of Melbourne strongly advocated for was to engage with the community and to form a genuine and meaningful partnership, which came about in a number of different ways. Precinct plans, which were co-designed, that had the community vision as the guiding document, which was starting to come through. And we found through our work that there was a very strong desire from the community to partner with council. And so we set up our Citizen Forester program. And that, as you can see, is looking at knowledge sharing, empowerment and advocacy, and really giving rise to, I think, last figure I sort of checked was about 300 urban foresters who are trained up and working closely with council to do studies, look at elm genetics, to help with ecology, all sorts of connections. And so this is a really interesting and really powerful program that not only sort of realises fantastic information, but it also starts to develop a stewardship of the forest and enables people to connect into it into a number of different ways. And I think one of the other exciting sort of things about sort of taking a greening approach is that it really enhances and enables fantastic transformation of the city. And one of the things which we all know is that within cities, change occurs all the time. And so what's really important for us is to ensure that when change occurs, that nature is at the heart of the design of the outcome in terms of the way of thinking. And I wanted to show you just a couple of examples quite quickly of work where I've seen cities transformed. And this is in Seoul and in Chongqing screen. And you can see there that there was an elevated freeway running through the heart of that. And you can imagine that on a hot day. So the transformation of that to re-giving the stream back to the community was really quite an extraordinary outcome. And that space is quite a delight to walk along, and it works on multiple different levels, from an event space to ecology. It provides cooling laterally either side of the stream, going back several city blocks. The removal of cars and parking made an enormous difference. So that's a space which is really quite extraordinary. And one of the keys or sort of messages that I got out of it was that basically the community just rejoiced because their stream had been given back to them. So there's that sense of resilience that comes through, and connectedness, which is super important. The High Line in New York is also another really interesting story, and some of the, this one's sort of well known in sort of urban design circles, but what I think it sort of really favours this for me is the fact that this was a community-led project. The town hall was going to take down the disused elevated rail line. You can see that on the left, that was what it looked like. On the right, what it was transformed. So it's around a connection and the community coming together to aid in transformation of the city in ways which benefit. And the last couple of slides were also sort of highlighted by Cecil, but the Otomachi Tower is a space. I mean, it's only, I think, 2.5 acres relatively small. But what that has done has been really quite extraordinary in terms of showing what is possible. And as well as creating space for people, which is quite marked and a delightful design, it's also created a space for habitat creation, and they've been monitoring bird numbers that have arrived and sort of come into, once this sort of patch of forest has been transformed across there, and there's something like 165 new species of birds which have come into this area. So we can start to see that there are ways which we can intervene with our green, which really, in a sense, unleashes the potential of the place and gives rise to multiple benefits that really make cities much healthier, much more livable, you know, respond to all of the challenges, but also not only make a city just hang in there, they actually transform it into a regenerative space, which is incredibly important for the health and well-being for everybody. And just to finish off, some work by Hundertwasser, and really what I really like about what Tim Beatley talks about there is really that nature needs to be at the centrepiece and not an afterthought. Thank you very much. Back to you, Rob.
Ian, if you stay with us, and I'll call Cecil back in. Ian, thank you for that. I wish you had an hour, because there's so much more that you've done that you could have covered off there, but we'll try and drag some of those out in the question time, but a fantastic presentation. Cecil, if you could come back and join us.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay,
good. All right. My screen was just not quite showing that. Thank you both. That was really quite inspiring. The challenge, I suppose, for all of us is, how do we, get the message out? How do we drive change? How do we connect with our communities? Have you got any experiences that you've had in terms of connecting with communities and driving change?
So I can jump in. Yeah, jump in quickly. No. I think, as you say, Rob, I think this is a key point, right? Because you can come with big plans and big ideas, and I'm sure Ian has a lot to say about this. But I think the most successful projects I've seen have actually had a very strong community involvement component, and in some cases, we're actually, like in the High Line, right, had a very strong community initiative component as well. And of course, it's complex because people have very different ways of connecting to trees and nature. So one has to look at that kind of sensitivity as well, which doesn't make our life easier. And in some cases, it might mean no trees, because that's not what people want. So I've seen some really exciting initiatives, for example, in Southeast Asia, where there's really a lot of drive about maybe using fruit trees and bringing food back into cities. So I do think there's some really interesting examples. But said Ian, I think you've been doing some really great work, like bottom-up work in Melbourne as well.
Yeah, look, I think a couple of thoughts sort of spring to mind, and I mentioned the precinct plans which the City of Melbourne put together, and that was a part of the, if you like, the implementation plans of the urban forest strategy. And we went out to engage with the community and to really set up a partnership with them, so that we went out and really almost said that, have a think about the trees. They're really important. Have a think about the urban forest, and think about it in these ways. So we started to talk about the science, talk about climate change, talked about reduction of heat, etc. So it was really about imparting knowledge, and then saying to the community, well, you've thought about it this way. This is your asset. Tell us what you want to do with it. And so having the drive coming from the community made an enormous benefit. We spent close to 3 years talking to the community, and one of the things that really struck me was, at the beginning we had our community engagement team said, look, now when you go out and talk to the community, you've got to sort of pitch it as though you're talking to a 12-year-old. Which I thought was sort of a very sort of demeaning thing. But we literally found, by having an intelligent conversation, we learned an enormous amount. The community learned an enormous amount. And so at the end of the 3 years of conversations, the level of understanding was much, much higher. So it was a very enabling conversation to have. And so, and it got to a point where we'd gone from what was almost an us versus them relationship from sort of government to community to one where the community was going, okay, well, you're talking about trees, when are we going to see them in the ground? We want more trees. And even down to, you know, streetscape levels, we spent a lot of time understanding and evaluating what the values of the community were, what was important through character, etc., etc. That fed into the outputs that we developed, which made a huge difference. And just sort of two things very briefly. One, we'd go into a street and have a talk to the people and sort of say, what do you want? And invariably the residents would say, we want small trees in the nature strip. Then we talked to them about the benefits of energy savings and, you know, shade and cooling, etc. And so at the end of the conversation, we had dozens of huge trees that the community wanted in the street. So it's how to have the conversation, to be open, to be honest, and you know, I think it's important. And the more we get the community to drive it, there's a project called the Yarra Strategic Plan, which has been done in Melbourne, which was led by sort of the water board, if you like, Melbourne Water. And what they did was to go out and have a conversation with the community about how to manage this iconic blood lifeline running through the centre of our city. And so the whole project is actually underpinned by a community vision. And so that is just fantastic in terms of being able to deliver on a strategic plan when you're referring back to a community written vision makes the work sing in a way that, you know, coming from a bureaucracy doesn't. So I think, you know, to my mind, it's, you know, and Rob, to your question, how do we get people across the line, and how do we get change and get transformation? We enable the community, we empower the community, and we give them a vote and a way to say what they want. And it's very clear. Every survey that's done just about what's important for the community is green, and it comes up all the time. So we just need to give people permission to act.
I think no, that's fine. I think one of the most exciting things that you did was you stored the data of every tree, and you gave each tree an email. And yes. Not realizing that what would happen is people started writing to your trees, and it went viral. And that tied into the app that you made that enabled people to walk around and identify trees.
Yes.
I think, you know, do you want to say a bit about that? Because that made it so accessible to everybody. I mean, you had oaks in North America writing to oaks in Melbourne.
And yeah, look, and I think it's sort of, you know, you rightly said we actually sort of initially did it so people would let us know if there was a problem with a tree, and so yes, so we were inundated by lots of wonderful emails that covered many different, I suppose, sort of levels of, you know, sort of deeply personal commentary through to humour. But, you know, the interesting thing too, Rob, is that our trees started writing back in response to those emails. And so that was, you know, something which has created, you know, yeah, look, as you said, it went viral. But in a way, you know, if we think about who our community is and we think about ways to connect and touch our community and enable them, then using technology is an incredibly important one. And so, you know, you know, in a sense, it's the 21st sort of century technological permission for people to hug a tree. And I think it really shows us how we cannot underestimate the importance of nature in people's lives, and giving people a way to, in a sense, open their hearts to nature is something that's incredibly important. And I think the other thing which is sort of interesting that came out of it too is that it enabled us to capture and utilise the community values in our decision-making processes. And you probably recall that there was one of the projects that our Department of Transport was keen on doing was improving traffic flows along this road called Punt Road. And on the corner of Punt Road and Alexandra Avenue is this beautiful big golden elm, which actually sits on land which is owned by the Transport Department. But it also happened to be the most emailed tree in Melbourne. And so when the Department of Transport came knocking and said, look, we're thinking about having a U-turn just here, what do you think? the fact that we were able to indicate that they might get a little bit of flack if they cut that tree down was very valuable in getting their design changed. So, you know, I think you know, a little bit of a happy accident there.
Great. Cecil, Ian talked about water and the important relationship between trees and water, and he did it through, you know, the green roofs. You know, those two things are intrinsically linked. What's your experience, and do people realize sufficiently the extent to which, you know, trees and impermeable surfaces are absolutely essential for this urban forest?
Yeah, I think that knowledge is coming in terms of as you say, right, the kind of the sponge effect of urban vegetation. Actually, when you have this stormwater events that happen more and more, that actually the urban forest can really help you to reduce, for example, the load on your infrastructure, which of course can become very expensive. So I think that part is definitely coming. I think also Ian was referring to the fact that the water input into the urban forest, and the fact that, of course, trees are increasingly facing droughts in urban environments. That, I think, is something that we sometimes don't understand enough. I know, for example, in Vancouver, many trees were really struggling the last years because of the warm summers and the lack of water. So I think there the understanding will have to be a little bit better. We have to be more clever, I think, in how we develop resilient urban forests. So I know a lot of people look at countries like Australia, where you have a bit more experience with that already. So, but there, I think definitely we need to be more aware that trees, of course, also need water to grow. Right? It's not only trees helping us to deal with water events.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we've been seeing images as we've seen the fires in, you know, California and elsewhere. We've seen the floods in Europe, and this relationship about more rain in a small period and the ability to control the overland flow. And Ian gave a really good example, I think, with the roofs. But I think equally, you know, there's a challenge there in, you know, getting the water into the ground and keeping it out of the pipes, and you know, sustaining that. And Ian, you've done a lot of work in that field, grey to green. What are some of your thoughts on that as well?
I mean, it's an interesting one, Rob. And we, you know, as you're very well aware, we had what was called a millennium drought, and we had 10 years of low water rainfall, and towards the end of that period of time, our trees were incredibly stressed. And what occurred was a realisation, because Melbourne has fantastic potable water coming through a closed catchment dam system. But through that drought, our dams nearly ran out of water. But people were starting to calculate, well, how much water does the city need in a year? How much rainfall falls on a city? And we put out into stormwater systems and out to the Bay and River. And we found that there was more water being discharged than the city needed to use in a year's time. So it brought about a big rethink about the role of water within the city. And so a lot of work was done in Melbourne over a number of years, where we did a lot of stormwater harvesting. So we actually created below ground reservoirs to capture the water. It was cleaned and then used to really provide high levels of water to have thriving vegetation. And we became relatively sophisticated. One of the latest ones was hooked up to rainfall event information, so that the catchment was discharged prior to it, so it decreased flood events, etc. So there's sort of those multiple benefits that start to come through. But one of the key things, and our research has shown, that where we've got trees which are grown in, if you like, in a water sensitive urban design context, they give us twice as much growth, and they're twice as healthy as trees which aren't given passive irrigation. So it's incredibly important for us not only to have the water, to not be caught out by droughts and water restrictions, to recognise that we don't want to have xerophytic landscapes that are drought tolerant. We want to have, grow the biggest water pumps we can to cool the city and to shade the city. So it's important that we've got water to green what's really vitally important for us. And a lot of that comes down to how we create below ground conditions and make it conducive to trees. There was some great work done a few years ago looking at a Bill of Rights for trees. I think it came out of the French Parliament, And they basically said that every tree has a right to enough below ground space and above ground space to grow to its natural dimensions. And in a way, it's sort of sound urban forestry practices that we want to do that. We don't want to have trees that are stressed or conflicting with infrastructure. We want to create good, healthy, natural growth.
Thank you, Ian. We've only got one question in the questions and answers, and it's from Jonathan Loth, and he says, what is the difference between a green wall and a green facade?
From my perspective, I'd just sort of say a green facade is where you have a plant such as a climber growing in the ground and it clings to the wall. And a green wall is where you have the growing media vertically up the wall and then plants growing out of that.
Okay, I think we'll go for the green facades with their feet in the ground, hey? Cecil, have you got any last comments? And I'll throw back to you, Ian, if you want a last comment. But Cecil, why don't you go first? We just right on time.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the chat comments and so that I'm just reading here really shows it, right? This is an exciting time. And I think there's so many great examples now of how greening can be done in a meaningful way, engaging communities, providing multiple benefits. As we heard from Ian, as we heard some of the examples we presented. So I think it's super exciting. I think we need to really build on those examples and make sure people hear about them. And not only within our own sectors, of course, but also especially people outside of the green fields. Because I really do think that they can be part of the solution to many of these challenges that we face.
Thank you. Ian, would you like a last comment?
Yeah, look, certainly concur with those thoughts. It's incredibly exciting and an enabling time. You know, I think the more we talk about greening, the better, and we move beyond having sort of greening as niche to mainstreamed. We really have the conversation isn't around us saying you should do this. It's more around, well, why wouldn't you do it? Because it's so smart to go down that path. And look, and the only other thing is to really invest in our education system. You know, I think we're seeing a lot of fantastic policy development worldwide. I think we need a lot of fantastic green professionals to help us deliver on that and to be the stewards over the period of time that we need to have. You know, we think of an urban forest, it lasts 100 years. You know, if you think about a steward, you might get 15 to 20 years if you're really fortunate. And that's where we should be focusing our time and energy, not on a 12-month financial cycle or a 4-year political cycle.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to both of you. In summing up, I think we've had a fantastic presentation tonight, and I think if you look in the chat, a lot of it was about engaging the community and how you get the community involved. And I think the beauty of urban forestry is it is the one intervention in a city that communities can, in fact, engage with easily, and they can make a difference. And I think the other comment I would make is we've had a brief discussion about the link between the importance of how we use our water and our trees. But the other thing is we need to be ambitious. I mean, one of the things that, and Ian didn't cover it, but he did, was he set ambitious targets. I mean, 22% canopy cover to 40% canopy cover. And in many ways, we need to set those targets because the higher levels of government aren't doing it. It has to happen in many cases from the citizenry through local government to, in fact, make things change. So I think we're in an incredibly exciting period. I think everybody's got a role to play. And if you think in a city that the biggest public space in the city are our streets, if you design a good street, you design a good city. So street trees and the way they interact with our cities are fundamental to the success and amenity of our cities in the future. So I thank you all for listening. I'm going to hand you back to Audrey, and thanks very much for allowing me to be your MC tonight. And
thanks for the presenters, Ian and Cecil, for really interesting presentations, and Rob for a really nice Q&A. A really very interesting topic, and as Rob, as you say, we could have gone on for days. It's really fascinating. And just to reiterate that our next session is on the 20th of October and that addresses biodiversity and the role of biodiversity that cities play in broader conservation and global conservation, and how biodiversity in cities can, how cities go about bringing in biodiversity. So that's 20th of October. I look forward to seeing you all again there. Remember, you can see the recordings. And until then, farewell. Thank you.